I want to thank the project for having me and being interested in my insights regarding history, Ottoman history, early modern history of the Eastern Mediterranean. And what I would like to do is first briefly say a few words about myself as by way of self-introduction, in order to lead later on to several points that I would like to make today. So I'll start describing myself as I'm a historian of the pre-modern Middle East. I'm interested in the Arabic and Turkish-speaking Middle East, early modern period. I translate it into, let's say, 15th to the 17th centuries. I believe those centuries are very important in shaping current realities. It's not the medieval period, which was really a very different world from what we know today. It's very different from our experience, but those intermediate centuries, 15th to the 17th centuries, in many ways shaped what we experience today. Sometimes it's not so intuitive to think about 300 years ago as directly relevant to our realities, but I see in many ways social realities, religious realities, political realities, that some of the roots of modern experience, modern realities, actually go back to decisions, circumstances, in those periods, definitely when it comes to our corner of the world. With regard to the period, 15th to the 17th centuries, and the region, the Arabic and Turkish-speaking regions of the Middle East, I'm mostly interested in health, medicine, and well-being, not politics per se, but let's say the more esoteric aspects of life. My understanding is that, well, politics is very important, but how many people are actually involved in politics today and back then in the past? So if we are interested in understanding what really people thought, what people really experience, what were their motivations, what they wanted to achieve, what were their successes as well as their failures. If we want to understand the masses of the people here in the Middle East, who they were and what they wanted to be, then we need to look for something that is relevant to everyone. And the cliche that health is really something, is a shared experience, is totally true. Health or death is something that we all experience. So my key into history, into understanding the past, and in that way understanding also the present, is via health and medicine. I mentioned that because some of the examples that I will draw upon in explaining the various headlines that I want to present will be taken from my research on health and well-being, not necessarily because my points are on health and well-being, but they will illustrate aspects of minorities or existence of minorities here in the Ottoman Middle East. So this was the introduction, and now to the points that I would like to raise. I have 4 points that I think are relevant and important. I'll start by saying that the Ottoman Empire was a multilingual, multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire. Now, this sounds a very basic fact, something that we all know, but this is very important to start with, even if it is obvious, because I immediately want to add that the Ottoman Empire was a working framework. It existed for 600 years. And if it existed for 600 years, apparently they knew how to run the state, they knew how to run the society, the culture was thriving, the economy was thriving. Otherwise, they wouldn't have survived 600 years. So something was working there, something was applicable, something made sense to the millions and millions of people who lived here in the Ottoman Empire. And at its height, the Ottoman Empire stretched all the way from Hungary to Yemen, from Algier to Iraq. So it was a multi-ethnic, we can think of empire, and it existed for 600 years with a major segment of minorities, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, and it worked. So I think that when it comes to understanding a possible framework of how making something work relevant, important to groups that are very heterogeneous, I think that the Ottoman Empire is a very interesting model. I don't think necessarily it's the only model relevant, but it is certainly a good model to think about when we think about how a society composed of many different groups and subgroups, how it can work together. I want to add that the Ottoman Empire was a working framework that it was far from being ideal. Although I'm an Ottomanist, but this is my profession, this is my career. It is also my hobby, and my students at Tel Aviv University sometimes accuse me that I'm too fond of the Ottomans, that I don't really accept the fact that the empire collapsed in the beginning of the 20th century. So although, yes, I'm a fan of the Ottoman Empire, I think that we have a lot to learn from them. I don't necessarily think that they were the best, whatever the best is. Their part of history was not ideal. So I think that exactly because it was not ideal, but it did make sense. And this is something that I want to emphasize. The different minority groups felt they belonged to the Ottoman Empire. They thought about themselves as being Ottomans. I think that this is exactly why it is a good model to learn from. So this is point number one. The Ottoman Empire was a working framework, not ideal, but exactly because it was working with all the limits, with all the defects. I think this is exactly what makes it an interesting historical case. The second point is that Jews and Christians, as well as other minorities, had a place in the Ottoman Empire. It was not necessarily a place of being equals. I already said that this is far from being ideal, but they had a place. And this is something that is worth emphasizing. The differences, for us, for modern us, this is a huge difference between equality and having a place. We aim for equality. I certainly uphold that value, but the Ottoman Empire didn't believe in equality. The Ottoman Empire, being a Muslim state, a Muslim society, was governed by Islamic rules. And Islamic rules meant that equality does not exist. God, Allah, did not create the world equal. By definition, there are differences in power, in wealth, in moral aptitude, in whatever. Human beings were not born equal. They were not born equal because of religion. Muslims are much more valued, much more important than non-Muslims. Men are much more valued than women. Grown-ups are much more important than children, and so on. So equality was something that didn't make sense to them. It was not a value. They didn't aim for that. Having said that, in the hierarchy, it was a very hierarchical society. Within that hierarchy, there was a place for everyone. We need to think about the Ottoman world, about the Eastern Mediterranean as an ecosystem. And in an ecosystem, every part, every component, every member has its role. It's not equal role, but everyone has a role to play for the benefit of everyone. So Jews and Christians, as other minorities, had a very important role to play, and it was appreciated, and it was defended, because for the benefit of the ecosystem, for the Ottoman ecosystem, it was obvious for everyone, for Muslims and non-Muslims, for Turkish-speaking and non-Turkish-speaking. We need everyone. So Jews and Christians had a place. It was not an equal place, but it was an important place and definitely accepted. I want to give an example to illustrate that place. And as I said, I will give examples from my own work on health and medicine, and I will briefly present here a court case from Jerusalem, 18th century. A plaintiff by the name of Musa. He was a Jew. He sued another Musa. The second Musa was a Christian, a Greek Christian, saying that a few years prior to the case, the Jewish Musa contracted the Christian Musa to act as a delivery person on his behalf, on behalf of the first Musa, to take something from Jerusalem, to bring it to Jaffa and load it onto a ship that was supposed to go somewhere in the Mediterranean. And they had a contract, they had a bargain, they shook hands. And now, a few years later, Musa number one claims that the delivery was not delivered, and he demands compensation. The second Musa, the Christian, says in his defense, well, it is true that I was hired for the job, but I had the plague. So I was sick. I couldn't do it myself. So I asked someone else. I subcontracted it to someone else. And here there are eyewitnesses who claim that, yes, the delivery had been done to Jaffa. Yes, it was not me, but someone else did it. So there's no reason to sue me. The judge in Jerusalem hears both parties and eventually decides in favor of Musa number two and excuse him for not doing himself because he succeeded in showing that the essence of the contract had been carried out. Why this is interesting for what we are now dealing with, that is the place of minorities in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Ottoman Muslim Eastern Mediterranean. We have a Jew and a Christian, and their case was decided, was heard, was judged in a Muslim, Ottoman Muslim court in Jerusalem. The fact that Jews, Christians, and Muslims came together in a very important, crucial social institution like the court, like the legal court, shows us the routine, the naturalization of the place of non-Muslims in an Ottoman society. while it is not unique for the Ottoman Empire, certainly we can see similar mechanisms in other Muslim states in the pre-modern world, because the component of Jews and Christians in the Ottoman Empire was so important. The percentage, we don't necessarily have exact numbers, but certainly in some regions, the component of Jews and Christians was very high. This case, this ordinary case of two parties coming to a Muslim judge and the Muslim judge decides the case, shows us how routine the place of Jews and Christians was in a Muslim society, in a Muslim state. And the case that I've just presented, it's so ordinary. There are millions of other cases from all over the Ottoman Empire. So Jews and Christians have had a place in the Ottoman Empire, in the Muslim Ottoman Empire. Not ideal, certainly not equal, but there was something very businesslike in dealing with Jews and Christians. At some point, this not ideal, but working business-like framework, at some point, this framework stopped functioning so well. And I would put the change somewhere during the 19th century. The 19th century and the rise of exclusive nationalism, or perhaps proto-nationalism, changed that business-like system. It worked as long as all the parties accepted that system and acted their role. Once some players did not accept these rules of the game and wanted another game. First, it was several Christian groups in various regions of the Ottoman Empire, in the Balkans, for example, in other areas. Later on, we can think also as we go to the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, we can also think about Zionism. When certain groups wanted more from the Ottoman system, they didn't accept any longer the role as participants, non-equal participants, then at that point when the system started to collapse. And during the 19th century, we see something that we haven't seen before, that we see a series of violent events between communities. Prior to the 19th century, we rarely see interfaith violence. Again, it's not ideal, so I can't say that it didn't exist or that it never happened, because here and there it did happen. But during the 19th century, we see it becomes much more rapid. Once the players wanted more for the system, and the Ottoman system was willing to give them some rights, but not all the rights that these communities wanted. In other words, once the system didn't make as sense as it did before to all the players, then the system started to collapse. And it is during the 19th century that we see this collapse. I want to add that it's not just religious. We can also see those strifes along ethnic lines. So it's not just religious. We see this pattern of groups. It could be Albanians. It could be the Druze. So we see all kinds of minority groups redefining themselves as minorities in the Ottoman Empire. They didn't want to stop being Ottomans. They certainly saw their future within the Ottoman Empire, but they did want to renegotiate their place within the Ottoman system. The Ottoman majority, the Muslim, Turkish-speaking majority, and also the Arabic-speaking majority, Muslim Ottomans, didn't have perhaps enough to offer or didn't negotiate well enough, and the system collapsed, and eventually it collapsed during World War I. So far what I have presented is that the Ottoman Empire was a working framework. The Jews and Christians had a place in the Ottoman Empire, not as equals, but they did have a place. And that during the 19th century, this system that worked rather well before experienced more and more challenges, more and more tensions, till it collapsed in World War I. The fourth and last point that I want to make is that despite all these tensions, despite all these problems, and even when it worked, it was not ideal. Despite all that, we do see in retrospect a presentation of the Ottomans' past in almost romantic colors, as idyllic. And it is very interesting to see that in retrospect, certain things are not remembered. We historians call it historical amnesia, that sometimes groups, communities, peoples, states tend to have a very elastic memory. They tend to forget certain things, they remember other things, sometimes they remember not so accurately. It's very normal, because this is what we do. We remember and we forget, and and the way we remember changes as we change. So it's a very normal, very normal process. But within that very normal process, it's interesting to see that in retrospect, certain communities in the Middle East now look back at the Ottoman Empire and remember it much more fondly than they remembered it 50 years ago or 150 years ago. And to give two very different examples that show that demonstrate this point, I want to say a few words about how Jews think about the Ottoman Empire and how post-national Arabs think about the Ottoman Empire. When we look at standard books about the Ottoman Empire that depict Jewish history as it related to the Ottoman Empire, as it related to the Eastern Mediterranean, we always return to the event of the Jews expelled from Iberia, finding a heaven, home in the Ottoman Empire. Totally true, totally correct. But that reality was complex. It was not just ideal. There were tensions. There were problems. There was the reality of finding a place in the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire certainly wanted those Jews from Iberia and gave them home when no other place in Europe gave them home. They gave them home, career, life, but they were not equal. And it's interesting to see that in retrospect, the Ottoman Empire is depicted by Jews, by Sephardi Jews, talk about the Ottoman Empire in a very romantic way that does not remember other aspects. And I will give an example that shows how history is interesting because it's complex, and those complexities are sometimes marginalized. 1571, the Ottoman Empire conquered Cyprus. And one of the things that the Ottoman Empire did whenever they conquered new area, they transfer populations from one place to another. Today, when we think about transfer, it's of course a very negative action. It's a way to for the state, for the power to be. It's a way for someone to punish a minority or a group that someone wants to dispose of. The Ottomans transferred communities not as a way of punishment. Sometimes it was a way of appreciation. If there was a community they appreciated their skill, they appreciated its loyalty, they wanted that community to be the backbone of their rule in a new area, new region that they have just conquered. That's exactly what happened in 1571 when the Ottoman Empire conquered Cyprus. They wanted a community that they could trust in that island as the beginning of the rule. So they looked around in the empire who they can trust and use them as the backbone of their bureaucracy. Jews. And the Ottoman Empire located the Jewish community in Safed, northern Israel, northern Eretz Israel, northern Palestine, and wanted to relocate, to transfer the whole community from Safed to Cyprus. And the Muslim judge of Safed even received a note, a decree from Istanbul saying, okay, please make sure that all the Jews of Safed are prepared to leave Safed. The boats in Jaffa will wait them at date such and such to be transferred to Cyprus because we want them there. The Jews in Safed wrote back to Istanbul requesting perhaps the Sultan might reconsider the decree because of course they are loyal subjects, and if the Sultan wants them in Cyprus, they will go to Cyprus. However, if they leave Safed, that means that they leave Safed. They will not pay their taxes in Safed. They will not help the economy in Safed. So the decree was reconsidered and the Jewish community in Safed stayed there. This example of showing that the Jews received treatment that like all other communities, Muslims and non-Muslim, Jews, Christians, Armenians, Greeks, including Arabs, the Ottoman Empire regarded them as a resource. And a resource can be distributed, can be moved, can be whatever the empire needs because it's a resource for an empire. It doesn't mean anyway, in no way does it mean that the Ottoman Empire didn't respect the Jews or abuse the Jews, because this was an act of appreciation. The Ottoman Empire wanted to transfer the Jews of Safed because they wanted their skills, but elsewhere. And this is something that the Ottomans did with all other communities. This shows us the business-like attitude of the Ottoman Empire to Jews, to Christians, to Armenians, to Greeks, to everyone. In other words, it's not ideal. And in retrospect, what is remembered about the Ottoman Empire is not necessarily those acts like in Safed, which for me show exactly why it was working, why the empire became such an empire, such a successful empire. In retrospect, the more colorful acts of having a Jew as a private physician to the Sultan, such extreme cases of being very close to the Sultan or to the center. These heroic acts, well, they're very interesting and so on. And of course, they show something about the role and the importance of Jews or Christians in the Ottoman Empire. They don't tell the non-heroic story, which was the reality. So I think that, again, in retrospect, the gray areas, the ordinary stories, which are not juicy necessarily, are not remembered in favor of something which is much more ideal. Now, this was an example from Jewish history here in the region. I can say something very, illustrate a very similar process when it comes to post-national Arabs. For many years, for several decades, the Arabs looked at the Ottoman Empire and looked at Turkey as a foreign entity here in the Middle East. The national states thought about Turkey, thought about the Ottoman Empire as foreigners, and having a modern national state, a realization of their right on their territory, instead of being ruled by someone who is a stranger. This is very interesting because for centuries, of course, Arabs didn't think about the Ottomans as being foreigners or illegitimate rulers. But during the first decades of nationalism, 20th century, certainly this was the shared vision about Turkey and the Ottoman Empire. Now, late 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, we see another shift. And now in the post-national period, we certainly see in several Arab communities in the Middle East, we see them looking back at the Ottoman Empire as with a sense of nostalgia. And it isn't to say that after decades of thinking differently about the Ottoman Empire, now, perhaps because of a shared religion, perhaps because of change of politics, geopolitics here in the region, Turkey and Ottoman history, Ottoman memory now is looked back much more fondly. And just to give one example out of many, when I made my first tours, research trips to Ottoman archives in Turkey, it was in the middle of the 1990s, I hardly saw any Arab scholar there. There were Israelis, of course, many Europeans, many Americans, even a group of Japanese. Hardly any Arab historian came to the Ottoman archives. They didn't learn Ottoman Turkish. They were not interested in that history. During the 21st century, certainly now, whenever I go to the Ottoman archives, I will always find someone from Egypt, now I will not find someone from Iraq and Syria because of obvious reasons, but a decade ago, yes, there were Iraqis, there were Syrians, there were Lebanese, there were people from the Emirates, from Yemen. And the numbers tell the story. Now they're interested in that history. When I combine all these 4 points, I think I can summarize the presentation by saying that the Ottoman Empire was successful exactly because it embraced its characteristic as a very heterogeneous society and culture. They didn't see that as a negative or as a setback or as a problem. They saw it as an asset. They accepted it and they worked with it. They worked with it and they certainly made sure that they handle all these groups together. I think that this is one of the things that we forgot how to do when we entered the national period, which is much more exclusive and doesn't give enough space to minorities, whether ethnic or religious.